kind of interaction is a little bit of a chance for you all to learn a little bit more about how people approach their projects and some of the hurdles, you know, that we all face as filmmakers. So again, we'll have plenty of time for questions. I'd like to start with you. I'd like to ask each of you what drew you to your project, and each of you has a very different style. We can already see that. And what drew you to that way of using the visual image and sound and so forth. But what drew you to the project for you, Bart?
I first heard about the imposter himself. I read about him in a Spanish language magazine, and there was an article about a man who had travelled the length and breadth of Europe, pretending to be a traumatized child. And what he would do is he would turn up in a town square in the middle of nowhere, and he would lie down. He would fall down in the street, or he would call the police pretending to be a tourist, having found a destitute child. The police would come, they would find the child, and he would be put into social service care quite quickly. And he did this for years of his life, you know, living as a... We're having a struggle with this. Can you guys still hear? Yeah. Right. So he lived as an orphan, effectively, until he was well into his 20s. And he... how are you doing with this? Do you want to...
I think it might... Why don't you use this one?
Okay.
I think it might be for the taping,
okay.
So it might be for that.
All right, okay.
So
he would go into social services, and he would stay there for months on end until they would begin to smell a rat. And at the point that they began to smell a rat, he would leave, and he would do the same thing. And he did it from he was in every country in Europe, and we had the Interpol reports that proved it. So I was fascinated by what motivated that and all the rest of it. And as I did more research, I found an article which talked about his time in Texas, where he had successfully stolen the identity of a child who'd been missing for 4 years, who disappeared. So the starting point was, what kind of a human being would commit a crime like that, and what kind of a family would fall victims to a crime because they took him in, he was given an American passport, he lived within the family for months as their child without them really realizing. And so that was the starting point for what became a really bewildering journey, and one which was confusing and compelling in equal measure.
And what about the choice of the visual approach of your film?
That was your question, wasn't it?
The style, yeah. That was part of my question, yeah.
I don't know how many of you guys have seen it, but there's obviously strong use of drama, and
you would call it reenactment?
I actually wouldn't, and I kind of feel like there's a reason. Reenactment implies that you have a very good understanding of precisely what happened, and you are reenacting it in a kind of forensic way. And I'm not sure that these are reconstructions, because what became apparent was that in this film there are 5 or 6 different conflicting versions of the truth, and so how do you make a documentary, if documentary is supposed to be about truth, how do you make a documentary which is about the elusiveness of truth, that there wasn't one single version, and so, but there were like 4 versions of what people wanted you to believe, and so what I wanted to do with the visualizations was to make it very clear that these are hyper-real, this is a memory that you're listening to, and so the idea was to try and construct, visualize their memories, that when someone tells you a story, you have a visual, you have a movie play in your head if they tell you a good story, and so the idea was to try and recreate all of those images that played in my head when I heard the stories, and to make a virtue of the fact that they're not real, and I make very clear with the drama that this isn't a single reality.
Right, you're not trying to fool the audience, right?
Definitely
not. That's a great explanation. So, yes, what drew you to your project?
So I was...
Bully, it's the Bully. Yeah.
It's the Bully Project, and as a kid I was bullied, and so I think as a filmmaker, you sort of, for me anyway, I try and find stories that I can have some kind of connection to, and I think that this was something that I'd thought about doing for a long, long time and just didn't sort of have the emotional or the kind of headspace to do it. And it sort of clicked for me when I started to hear about the rise of suicides, or just became aware of the number of suicides that were linked to bullying, and kind of said, okay, well, I actually should do this thing. And then I originally conceived of it as like a bigger kind of look at bullying. So going from the sort of playground to, sorry.
He should know that we're
He should, yeah.
It's the organizer of the
That
festival.
it's David Wilson calling.
He should know
I'm
that
gonna ignore that.
We're busy.
So I was looking at like kids, adults, workplace, and also into government and policy, and how like at the time like George Bush was president, so there was this sort of like sense of this kind of like political bully was really big, and then once we started, like it really just drilled down to the stories of kids and families. And the other thing that I would just say is that, like, for me, I was interested in this notion of giving a voice to youth that don't really have a voice. And I think that bullying lives in a world of sort of silence and shame, and being told that the thing that you're experiencing isn't valid. And so the idea of kind of arming those kids with the power of film was really intriguing and exciting. And that's the sort of genesis of the film.
Yeah, and it's something that's very hard for them to talk about, and you gave them a way to do it.
Yeah, I would say surprisingly it wasn't that hard for them to talk about. I think that they're
Once they were
desperate
asked.
to talk
Yeah.
about it.
Once
Yeah.
somebody asked, okay.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that, the asking those questions.
Okay.
So do we have, does your mic, let's find out if your mic works. Could we? What's that? Her mic's good, okay.
You want me to use this
A little
one?
bit of what you drew to your project, and also the approach you took in the project.
What drew me to my project?
Yeah,
I
you
started
making-
making
yeah.
films. I understood that I had access to a good story. It was mine for the taking. I was very instrumentalist. I wasn't thinking, period. I was just saying, okay, well, here's a good story. It's mine to tell. I'm going to use it, sort of. That was the beginning. And then questions of how to tell it came up really fast. And then questions of, well, whose story is it? And how, and who, not just who's telling the story, but, whose story is it? If you take the line that I gave you before, a man who fathered 5 children to 5 different women, is it his story? Is it the children's story? Is it women's story? Is, who's the protagonist, or who are the minor characters? These kinds of stories are usually he came, he saw, he conquered. Maybe he has a woman or a child. Maybe they're mentioned, the proverbial women and children, sort of backdrop and all that. And by the end, I sort of constructed something that's almost the reverse shot. It's from, it's almost like the guy from behind. He's on stage, there's the audience, but we're looking at him from backstage, and in a sense assuming center stage as a result, and he kind of gets muted in the process.
Who is the protagonist? Who did you find to be the protagonist?
I think my father and I kind of switch off playing protagonist and antagonist throughout the film. We're sort of both the people you love and hate the most by film's end. Something like that.
Did you already know all the people who end up in your film, or did you come
Yeah.
upon a number of them as you went?
No, I knew everybody, but I hadn't seen one of them since I was a child. One of the women who's sort of the odd woman out, and her child is the odd child out. Yeah.
So they're all, okay, and you,
But everybody's there by film's end. Everybody's in it,
Everybody's there,
yeah, and
yeah.
everybody has their chapter, and everybody has a number, a serial number, kind of. And those who saw it, woman number 1, 2, 3.
right. And
You're-
the visual approach. Oh, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
No, it's funny, like, I'm so excited to see your film, but a friend of mine, it reminds me of a film that a South African filmmaker made a few years ago, and it was, he's a Zulu guy, and his father was this sort of mythical figure that he didn't know very well, and his father dies, and he goes to the funeral, and when he gets there, they're like wives and children to the left, and he finds out he's got 57 brothers and sisters, and so he makes this film called Don't Fuck With Me, I've got 57 brothers and sisters. And but what's interesting, and I think his struggle in making the movie was like the extent to which he puts himself in the film or not. And was that a really difficult part of making this film? Was like
It was the difficult part of making the film, because I sort of wanted to pretend I didn't have to be there at all.
But you did.
But finally I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you knew almost everybody going in. You knew probably nobody going in. You had an idea, and you went out to meet people.
Yeah.
And how about you? I'm just trying to get a distinction here. What about you? Did you go into the story knowing anyone?
No, not at all.
All fresh relationships.
Completely, yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, let me start with Lee. I think you have the more clear sense of having to ask people to talk about things that are very intimate and probably difficult to talk about. There's a fantastic interview that goes throughout the film of, I'm forgetting the name of the father's name.
David Long?
The one whose son commits
Yeah.
suicide at age 17. We really
Yeah.
meet him and his family, and the film spends a lot of time with them. And that's a very beautiful, intimate interview. Very, he's an awesome person and character. How did you lead up to? Did you have to spend time with him? How did you get to the point where he would trust you that much? Or was it? Is that just who he is, no matter what?
It's hard to say because
Okay.
I'm myself, so I don't know what
Well, did
would
you
have
spend
happened.
time with him and
I
his
do.
family?
What I generally did on this film is I never filmed with somebody on day one.
Okay.
So day one was always a dinner meeting, talking for hours, and in this particular case, like I had, it was I think easier because I could say that this was something that I experienced and
Yes.
explain why I'd come to the narrative and why I wanted to tell their story and because I think that there's a process whereby people want to try and size you up and understand where you're coming
Definitely,
from.
yeah.
And I think the worst thing that you could possibly do is sort of show up with a camera immediately. You have to kind of come up, at least for me, have some kind of agreement and partnership.
doing
because
this? Yeah.
So I look at the people in my film not as subjects but as partners, in particular for this project. And it may be different on other projects, but with the teenagers as well, it was about them choosing to participate and sharing a vision. And so that was a critical piece of our engagement.
Right. So, did you interview him?
So back
next
to
day?
David.
Yeah. Right.
David, I spent probably a week with that family at the beginning.
Okay.
And it unfolded over the course of that week. I can't remember where it happened. I know it was late at night. I know that everyone had gone out, that we sat together for a long time, and that was where that interview happened. It was the very beginning of my filmmaking process, so I didn't have a sound man. I had nothing, and so the sound is really bad, but it was totally powerful, and it was very, very intimate. It was just the two of us. I was operating and talking to him, and but yeah. I mean, people, I think, once they agree, then they share. And it's never sort of they half share. I feel like they're in or they're out, and if they're in, then they're in.
Right.
And you're subjects.
And if you're on the inside, I think that's also a critical point when a filmmaker gets on the inside of a story. And you, in a sense, started out almost on the inside because you had shared the experience and you shared that with them. But there's another situation, I just want to ask a little bit more of this,
Okay.
where there's another family. So this young man had committed suicide, and you meet the family who is very open and grieving and just speak about him in the most eloquent ways. And you sense that you know each other. There's another family whose child has also committed suicide, a little younger boy, I believe he's 11. He was 11. And it appears in the film that you met them on the day of his funeral.
I did.
And that's a very different situation. And yet they have radio mics on and they are willing to let you be there when their child has obviously died within days. So that's a very different situation. How did that happen?
So that happened, obviously without a lot of communication. I heard about this tragedy. I was shooting not very far from there with a different story or family. And my producer, who did an amazing job, managed to reach, I guess it was the funeral. He had done a story and said, I want to tell my story. And my kid was bullied, and this is why he's no longer, he was very, it was very clear that the narrative in the case of this tragic loss was a bullying narrative. And so we reached out and we got the funeral director, and I guess that night I got a phone call back from the father who you're speaking about, and he said, what are you trying to do? What's your film? And
he asked you?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I explained the film, and we didn't have a very long conversation. He
On
said,
the
well,
phone?
yeah. He said, well, come on, I'll see you tomorrow morning, and hung up the phone. And that was that. And then so I drove whatever, got there, met him. We didn't speak very much. He just said, what do you need? And I said, I need you to wear this. And then that was it. And then at the end of the day, it was very, very powerful. He said to me, hurry up. Don't take too long with this project.
Making this film, yeah.
And he took his mic off and he handed it back to me. And he said, we're done now. And it was very, very, I can't explain it.
He didn't want to do it.
I didn't, it was literally like at the end of the funeral, he sort of had a very conscious switch where he said, okay, now we're done. And hurry up and go make your film.
He does appear again, though.
He does.
So he decided to come back, or you got him to come back.
Well,
yeah.
we were just done for that day.
Oh, done for. He didn't mean. I
You're
don't
never
wanna,
done with
this
a
is
documentary
Yeah, right,
filmmaker
that's
once
true.
you say
Okay.
yes. It's like,
Okay.
I think it was 2 days later that I went to their house and spent the day with them.
Okay. So let me ask you, Bart. Your film is partly about trying to get to the truth. Would you say?
Yeah. Or how do you, if there is no single truth,
Let's see.
how do you?
Want to try that one?
Yeah.
Is that working? Okay.
Yeah. So if there isn't going to be one definitive version of the truth, there we go. How do you if documentary is about sort of the pursuit of truth, and there are conflicting versions, how do you reconcile that? And the solution seemed to me that making the film, you go from, it's very difficult to talk about it for people who haven't seen it without kind of spoiling what is a big, very significant twist in the story, but I think probably there's no way to avoid that, is it? Ultimately, the family who take in the imposter get accused and investigated for having murdered their own child. And so how do you, how do you approach that? But also, I suppose the idea was, to try and replicate the journey that I had gone on as a documentary maker. So you go and you meet with the FBI and you come away going, there's no question this family had something to do with the disappearance of the kid. The next day you'll have an interview with a member of the family and you'll have come away thinking there's just no way they could have had anything to do about it. They just desperately wanted to believe.
So what's
that
the
this was their
truth?
kind.
Yeah.
So there wasn't,
Right.
so there was never going to be a definitive answer. There's, and there are some things which I will leave for you to see when you see the film. But, that was, so that process where, as a filmmaker, you're like going from one extreme of this is what happened to the opposite extreme the next day. That felt like a really important thing to try and put in the film so that the audience would go on that same journey that I went on. And it was like a thriller, and it felt like being in a detective story, and and a pretty far-fetched one at that. You know, I mean, you couldn't, you know, if it was a work of fiction, you just wouldn't believe it.
Well, so you got to know the family of the boy who was lost. Well, let me just ask you how long you had known them and what kind of nature of the relationship. Was it strictly filmmaker, subject? Because in the end, you had to ask them some difficult questions, and I kind of like to know what's the background you were coming from when you sat to talk to them, trying to find out the truth from them.
I think, you know, like Lisa's, you know, as a documentary maker, you know, you do end up in people's lives who you really have no business being with, which is one of the amazing things that, you know, it's the amazing thing about it. If you're, you know, like us and you're kind of fascinated with people and you're nosy, you know, you end up doing, you know, having these relationships with people that life wouldn't have brought you to. And but at the same time, it's quite important not to tell them that you're there to be friends or to be a kind of counsellor or that you're there to be clear about what it is. You know, this story, that was a difficult thing, you know, for them. They wanted this story in the past, but at the same time, they'd never told their side of the story. There'd been things written, they'd never been able to actually say, this is what, you know.
They were never able to tell their story even to the media?
Not really. I mean, there's a big article in the New Yorker, and, you know, you come away, having read that, you come away feeling, yes, they probably did have something to do with the disappearance, and that they were furious about that, and they also felt like how did they know that we weren't going to do a similar thing? You know, were we going to give them the chance to say all of their things?
Or were you going to twist their story somehow, or use it somehow?
And the important thing is
they decide to trust you. They had to decide to.
And like these guys say, you know, the key is, and I shoot in a very different way. You know, the film was always going to be a kind of thriller and had to have a visual language which reflected that. So, you know, we shot with a very big camera and it was quite heavily lit. But at the same time, you have to create an environment where at the end, when you're doing the interview, there's just you, the DOP, and, you know, we had the sound people set up, and then they will go outside, and everyone else, and the camera system.
So it's you and them,
Yeah, and then you just talk and talk and talk, and then and then it kind of, you know, and they get a sense of where you're coming from and why you know, just as any relationship as it kind of develops.
So what was the toughest question, or where did you feel it was most difficult to proceed with them?
I mean, you know, there is a point where, you know, I had to put those really difficult questions that were out there to them.
Like,
you know.
Did you have something to do